Today my son and I are going to make a little video on how to pull the transmission out of his 98 Jeep Wrangler TJ. We're pulling the transmission in order to change the input bearing on the front of the transmission. But if you're doing a clutch job, you're going to have to pull the transmission, and this video may help you. We will get down to the pressure plate on the flywheel as far as where we're going on this video. First thing to do is, when you pull the Jeep in, leave the transmission in third gear, as this will be required to pull the shift lever up out of the shift tower. Here we go. Here's a list of the tools you're going to need to pull the transmission. My son and I did ours in about 2.5 hours. We used a couple of air tools. Even with hand tools, with two people, it shouldn't take more than 3 hours to pull this out. Probably a clutch job would take you in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 hours to complete. Totally back in and drivable again. We used a transmission jack from Harbor Freight. I think it was about $70 or $80 when we bought it, probably a year ago. The other thing you're going to need is a pilot bearing puller, and I do know that those are available for loan at least O'Reilly's parts stores, and I believe several auto parts stores have them to loan out for free. Makes it a lot easier with a floor jack. You can do it as long as you get the Jeep in the air. Even on a lifted Jeep, you can pull the transmission without jacking it up. We find it makes it a little easier, but whatever floats your boat. And good luck on your project. We're going to pull a transmission in this, so the first thing we need to do is take the negative cable off the battery. There's sure a lot of wires on that battery.
It's a lot of junk it runs.
Next thing we're going to do is we're going to jack up the front and get a couple of jack stands under it. Just like that.
Yeah. Shaker.
Next thing we're going to do is jack up the rear and put 2 jack stands under the rear axle. And we're going to try to make it so the back is a little bit higher than the front. We wanted the back a little higher than the front so that when we lowered the transmission, it was closer to being on the same plane as the floor. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to unbolt the 4 nuts that hold the transmission mount to the skid at 13 millimeter. Then we're going to place a jack with a block of wood underneath the skid to hold the weight of the transmission while we take out the 6 bolts that are holding the skid to the frame. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to lower the skid and the transmission, and we've placed a jack stand with a block on the top underneath the engine oil pan to support the weight of the engine since we're removing the back mount. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and pull the skid out from under the Jeep. What we're going to do is we're going to remove both drive shafts. Actually, the back one can be done before you remove the skid, and it might be even a little easier, but we didn't. Takes an 8mm wrench.
And then push that way?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just use a screwdriver to pry out the U-joint once you get the bolts out. And then pull it out to the side, being careful not to lose the caps on the end of the U-joint. Once you do that, the U-joint will slide off the shaft on the transmission or on the transfer case. What we're going to do is take the front drive shaft off, starting at the end on the pinion. Same 8mm. This time we're going to use a little 1/4" drive ratchet. Now we're going to unbolt the front drive shaft at the transfer case. It's also 8mm. Okay, after the 4 bolts in the drive shaft are removed on the transfer case end, now we're going to pry the back of the pinion end of the drive shaft just a little bit out of the pinion yoke and remove the drive shaft. Okay, and then just pull it out. Sometimes you may have to use a screwdriver in the front yoke to kind of pry it, because they can be a little tight sometimes. Drain the oil on this AX15 transmission because we're going to change the input shaft bearing. If you're doing a clutch job, you won't have to do that. We're going to use a 15/16 wrench for the oil drain plug. After draining, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the plug. We're going to remove the starter. You can get to the top starter bolt over the top of the frame right behind the rear tire with a 15mm wrench. Starter bolt's 14mm, and you reach that from underneath right along the exhaust pipe on the back of the bell housing. Then just pull the starter back out, and you can set it right back up on the frame on the inner fender wall. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of the motor or the transmission mount off the bottom of the transmission using a 16mm socket. And then slide it off the muffler hanger, or the cat hanger I should say. This transmission has a Novak shifter cable, or the transfer case has a Novak shifter cable on it. So we're going to go ahead and disconnect that. If yours has a stock linkage, you're going to have to disconnect the stock linkage. What we're going to do is remove the slave cylinder. It takes a 1/2-inch deep well socket. It's on the driver's side of the transmission in the bell housing. Two studs with nuts on them, one on the top and one on the bottom. Just a caution, be sure that you don't mix these two nuts up with the nuts that are on the bottom transfer case mount. They look identical, but these are American threads, and the ones on the bottom of the transfer case skid are metric. Once the slave cylinder is unbolted, you can simply pull it out. Then just tie it up to the side. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and disconnect all the wiring harnesses from the transfer case and the transmission. You'll find several up on the top. I think there's, what, about three or four. They go to things like the speedometer, reverse switch, backup lights, things like that. But just make sure you get all the wiring harnesses disconnected that go to the transmission or the transfer case up on top. The wire's all disconnected. Now we're going to take off the vent hose on the transfer case. However, on an AX-15, just has a collar around the top of the tower. You remove the boot, and then the collar pushes down and turns counterclockwise about 1/4 of a turn, and it's spring loaded and it should just pop out. On some of them it's easier said than done, but we've had this transmission out before, and hopefully this one will be fairly easy. Okay, here's what the collar looks like. Now all there is to it is just to pull the shift lever straight up. I'll go up top and do that. Two top bolts holding the transmission or the bell housing to the engine have E12 Torx heads on them. This is an E12 Torx socket. They're available at Napa or Sears or wherever you buy your tools. But it's very beneficial to have this socket to remove the transmission. Two E12 Torx head bolts are right at the very top of the transmission.
I got right there.
Next thing we're going to do is remove the CPS sensor that is right there. Takes an 11mm socket.
We gotta have a swivel on it.
And then we're just going to tuck it in and out of the way. There's 3 little screw type bolts that come in from the front of the on the engine side towards the bell housing that have 1/2-inch heads. There's one on the bottom and there's one higher on each side. So we'll take those out now. Here's the one on the driver's side. The one on the passenger side is in a similar spot. And it's easiest to get them over the top of the frame on both sides. What these screws look like. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take off the 2 through bolts on the bottom of the bell housing. They're 18mm heads. And they're also backed up with a nut, so it's also 18mm. Okay, from here the only 2 things holding this transmission on the engine are the 2 side bolts. That one right there, and the one on the opposite side in the same place. Those are the ones that go through the guide pins that that line up the transmission bell housing with the engine. We're going to go ahead and take those off, but first we're going to put a transmission jack underneath the transmission. Got the transmission jack under it, and we're going to go ahead and start taking off the 2 remaining bolts that are holding the bell housing to the engine. Alright, we're going to go ahead and take this last bolt out on the side. He did the bolt on the passenger side while you weren't looking. So that takes care of all the bolts around the bell housing to the engine. Now hopefully we'll be able to slide this whole thing back. Sometimes these things get stuck on the guide pins and they're hard to get started back. we'll see how this one goes. It's been out like at least 2 additional times before. So sometimes just shake it a little bit. Let's try going up a little bit with the jack. Just a little bit. Okay. Sometimes it can be a little pain to get these things apart, and sometimes it's beneficial to stick a little putty knife in where the guide pins are and kind of get it wedged, and then go to a screwdriver, something a little bit wider, and just pry. It also helps as you're coming out to either lower or raise the jack to keep the bell housing kind of parallel with the back of the engine block. And sometimes as you pull out, you have to lower or raise depending on the slope of your transmission. But once it gets started, it'll come out fairly easy. Probably have to lower it once you're pulling back a little bit to clear the bell housing. You got the jack way off the front wheels here. Just push down the end. There you go. And then it should come right apart. Now we're looking at the back of the engine. What you're looking at is the pressure plate. These are the fingers of the pressure plate that the throwout bearing rides against. And when you push in the clutch, the throwout bearing pushes in on these fingers. That releases the clutch plate, which is inside here, that has these splines on it, and that the transmission input shaft slides into. When you release the clutch, it releases these fingers, and this pressure plate pinches the clutch plate between this pressure plate and this flywheel. If you were doing a clutch job, you would remove the 6 bolts around this pressure plate, and this pressure plate would come off, and along with it the clutch plate. That's pretty much it for doing a clutch job. A little emery cloth on the flywheel to clean it up if it's not heat checked or warped, and your new clutch plate goes on along with your new pressure plate. You use your clutch alignment tool that comes with your kit to center it, put new pilot bearing in the back of the crankshaft, and reassemble it. Inside of the bell housing, the slave cylinder presses against the back of this arm right here, if you can see my finger, and moves the throwout bearing back and forth on the collar on the input shaft right here. See, if I pull that up, it comes forward. This is the part that presses against those fingers on the pressure plate. This part of the shaft right here rides in the pilot bearing that's in the back of the crankshaft, and these splines engage the clutch plate that's between the pressure plate and the flywheel. So that when you step on the clutch, it pushes the slave cylinder in just like that and releases the clutch plate. One thing to watch out for when you're doing a clutch is this little spring clip here. It's hard to see, but there's a little spring clip here that clips over a ball joint on this release arm. And a lot of times they get broken or rusted out and they're missing, or people forget to put them back, or just don't realize they were there in the first place because they're gone. And if you don't put that back, what you're going to have is, while you're driving, you might hear a little rattle, and it's because this arm right here is rattling against this ball because there's nothing holding it tight. And then when you step on the clutch, the rattling stops because it forces this arm back against this ball when the throw-out bearing is pressed against the pressure plate. So just a little heads up there, if you're doing a clutch job, pick up one of those little clips at the dealer. We hope this video has been a help and gives you the confidence you need to go ahead and pull your transmission and do a clutch job on your own. Saves you big bucks by being able to do it yourself. We recommend the Luck clutch. It's available on a lot of the discount parts suppliers. They're great clutches for these TJ Wranglers. You really don't need to spend big bucks on a clutch. Thanks for watching.